Vince Masuka never took anything seriously. No matter how gruesome the crime scene, how disturbing the details, he always had a joke ready. But then, one moment changed everything. A young woman walked into Miami Metro, looked him straight in the eye, and said 6 words that hit him harder than anything before. "I think you're my father." For the first time, Masuka was completely speechless. No joke, no escape, just the crushing weight of a reality he never expected. In this video, we're breaking down how this moment flipped Masuka's world upside down, and it might just change the way you see him forever. Let's dive in. At first, Masuka did what he always did. He laughed. Because if he could turn something into a joke, he didn't have to process it. But this time, something was different. This wasn't an awkward encounter he could brush off with a one-liner. This wasn't a weird social situation he could deflect with an inappropriate remark. This was real. He looked at Nikki, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, his usual carefree smirk faltered. There was a resemblance. The DNA test confirmed it. He was a father, and the truth, that terrified him. Masuka had built his entire life around avoiding responsibility. No wife, no kids, no obligations beyond his job. He was the fun guy, the class clown, the forensic expert who never had to worry about anything except blood spatter and bad puns. But in the blink of an eye, that changed. He wasn't just Vince Masuka, the pervy forensic analyst. He was someone's father. But here's the real question. What did that even mean for him? Masuka didn't have a blueprint for fatherhood. He hadn't spent his life preparing for this. He wasn't Batista, who always balanced his family with his career. He wasn't Dexter, who spent years wrestling with the idea of being a father while hiding his darkest self. Masuka was different. His entire identity was built on never needing to grow up. And now, that identity was being ripped away. That's why his first instinct was to laugh. It wasn't just about avoiding the weight of the moment. It was about clinging to the only version of himself he had ever known. Because if he took this seriously, if he really accepted what was happening, then he had to admit something terrifying. His life had just changed forever, and deep down, he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. But this wasn't just about Masuka facing fatherhood. This was about how others saw him, and how that was about to change forever. Think about it. Masuka had spent years being the office clown, the guy everyone laughed at but never really took seriously. He was the inappropriate jokester, the side character in everyone else's story. His role was simple: crack jokes, lighten the mood, keep things from ever feeling too real. But fatherhood? That was different. Fatherhood meant maturity. It meant respectability. It meant being someone others looked up to, and that was something Masuka had never been. So when Nikki showed up, he wasn't just being forced to confront his own future. He was being forced to change how others saw him. He was no longer just a crude jokester. He was a dad. And for Masuka, that was almost harder to process than the fact that he had a daughter in the first place. But here's the real kicker. This life-altering moment was something that Nikki had time to prepare for. She had taken the DNA test. She had searched for him. She had already accepted the reality of their connection before she even walked through the doors of Miami Metro. Masuka, he got zero warning. One minute, he was a single, responsibility-free guy. The next, he had a 20-something-year-old daughter staring at him, expecting something. And that's why his reaction makes perfect sense. This wasn't a situation where he could ease into fatherhood. He had no transition period, no time to process. He was thrown into the deep end without a life jacket, expected to play a role he had never even imagined himself in. And let's not forget, Masuka's life up to this point had been anything but father material. His life was crime scenes, blood spatter analysis, and dirty jokes. His routine was analyzing homicide victims, not helping a college student figure out financial aid. He was an expert at understanding patterns of blood. But he had zero understanding of how to build a meaningful relationship with another human being, especially his own daughter. So, was it really surprising that his first response was to joke? And here's the real question. If Masuka had had time to process this, would his reaction have been different? If he had months, weeks, even days to prepare for this, would he still have laughed? Or would he have run? Because here's something nobody really talks about. Masuka had an out. He could have rejected Nikki outright. He could have denied the DNA test, refused to engage, told her to leave him alone. But he didn't. Despite his fear, despite his panic, despite the fact that every fiber of his being was screaming at him to avoid this, he stayed. He listened. He didn't push her away, and that's important, because as much as Masuka tried to convince himself that he wasn't father material, as much as he wanted to pretend that this was just some weird, surreal, sitcom-style misunderstanding. Deep down, he didn't walk away. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe some small part of him actually wanted to know what it meant to be a dad, even if he had no idea how to do it. Masuka's first instinct wasn't to build a real relationship with Nikki. It was to fix the situation the only way he knew how, with money. Almost immediately, he offered to pay for her college tuition. And sure, that's a nice gesture, but it also revealed something deeper about Masuka's mindset. He thought that being a father meant providing financial support, not emotional connection, because that was the easy way out. But Nikki hadn't come looking for a paycheck. She had come looking for something else, and that's where things started to unravel. Masuka's instinct to fix things with money wasn't just about convenience. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what fatherhood actually is. To him, being a good parent meant making sure his child was financially stable. You provide, and that should be enough. No deep talks, no emotional vulnerability, no uncomfortable responsibilities. But deep down, Masuka knew better. Because here's the thing, paying for college was an action, but it wasn't a connection. And that's what Nikki was really looking for. She didn't show up at Miami Metro with a tuition bill in her hand. She showed up because she wanted to know her father. And Masuka? He had no idea how to give her that. That's why, when handing over money didn't instantly create the father-daughter bond he expected, he panicked. He didn't know what else to do. So he avoided the problem in the only way he could think of, by making Nikki part of his world at Miami Metro. He pulled some strings, got her an internship, introduced her to his colleagues, and in his mind, that probably felt like progress. But let's take a step back. Was it really? Because this wasn't about bringing Nikki into his life. It was about making her fit into his routine so he wouldn't have to change. He didn't step into her world. He didn't ask her about her past, her childhood, her interests, or what she actually wanted from him. Instead, he made sure that she fit into his life rather than stepping into hers. And that's where Masuka's biggest mistake was. He thought inclusion was the same as connection, that just having her around was enough. But the truth is, he never really let her in. On the surface, this might not seem like a big deal, but in reality, it's avoidance at its finest. Because bringing Nikki into Miami Metro wasn't about her. It was about Masuka. It was about keeping things familiar, about making her presence feel like just another casual part of his life. By keeping her in a professional setting, he could avoid the emotional weight of their new dynamic. At work, he could still be Vince Masuka, respected forensic expert, occasional pervert, lighthearted comic relief. He didn't have to be dad. And that's exactly why, despite all his efforts, Masuka felt like he was failing. Because no matter how much money he gave her, no matter how much he tried to pull her into his world, one thing remained painfully clear. He didn't actually know her. And worse, he had no idea how to change that. And here's where things get complicated. Because while Masuka was struggling with his new reality, a question started creeping into his mind. Why had Nikki really sought him out? Was this truly about family? Or was there something else at play? Think about it. Nikki never knew Masuka growing up. She had no memories of him, no connection. Then, out of nowhere, she takes a DNA test, finds out he's her father, and just shows up? On the surface, this seemed like a heartwarming moment, one of those long-lost family reunions you'd expect in a movie. But in reality, things rarely work that way. And as much as Masuka wanted to believe in the fairy tale version of their relationship, he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt creeping into his mind. Because just as quickly as Nikki had entered his life, red flags started to appear. The first, timing. Masuka learned that Nikki had been struggling financially before she found him. She wasn't exactly in a stable situation. She needed money, she needed security, and then suddenly, she found out her biological father was a guy with a well-paying job and no other dependents. Was it really a coincidence that she decided to track him down at that exact moment? Or was this less about a father-daughter reunion and more about finding a financial safety net? The second red flag? Her instant acceptance of him. Think about how most people would react in her situation. If you suddenly found out that your biological father was a man you had never met, a man who never even knew you existed, wouldn't you have questions? Wouldn't you feel some kind of resentment? But Nikki didn't. She walked into Masuka's life way too easily, almost like she had already decided that reconnecting with him would be beneficial. And that's what made it so hard to tell if she was genuine. If she had been hesitant, if she had confronted Masuka about not being there, if she had demanded to know why he had never been in her life, it would have made the situation feel more real, more human. But she didn't. She slid right into her new role as Masuka's daughter, without any visible emotional struggle, and that's what made Masuka uneasy. Because in his experience, relationships, real relationships, weren't that simple. But here's where it gets really interesting. Masuka never confronted her about it. He had his suspicions. He questioned her motives internally. But did he ever sit her down and ask? Did he ever push for an honest answer? And that tells us something important about Masuka, because deep down, he didn't want to know. If he asked, and she admitted that she only came to him for financial reasons, it would break him. It would confirm the fear he already had, the fear that he wasn't actually wanted, just useful. And if she denied it, if she told him that she truly wanted a father, that might have been even worse. Because then, he would have to accept that she was serious, that she really wanted something from him that he wasn't sure he could give. So instead, Masuka did what he always did. He avoided it. He let the doubt fester, but he never acted on it. Because pretending everything was fine was easier than facing the possibility that his daughter might not actually want him. Just the security that came with being his daughter. It's ironic, really. Masuka and Dexter both found themselves thrown into fatherhood in ways they never expected. Neither of them had planned for it. Neither of them had experience, and yet they were both forced to figure it out, with vastly different results. Dexter had Harrison. Masuka had Nikki. But where Dexter's entire life revolved around keeping his son in the dark about who he really was, Masuka had the opposite problem. He had no idea how to let Nikki in. And that right there is what makes this comparison so interesting. Dexter's approach to fatherhood was rooted in control. From the moment Harrison was born, Dexter saw him as something to be managed rather than nurtured. His entire parenting philosophy revolved around one belief. If he could control his son's environment, he could protect him. Protect him from the world, from danger, from the truth, both about himself and about the darkness lurking inside him. But that's not parenting. That's containment. Dexter's goal was never to form a genuine connection with Harrison. It was to preserve the illusion that everything was normal. Every decision he made was calculated. Every moment of affection carefully crafted to maintain an image. His fatherhood wasn't built on love or emotional openness. It was built on deception. Masuka, on the other hand, he had no plan at all. He had never even considered fatherhood as a possibility, let alone something he would have to navigate. Unlike Dexter, who had years to slowly develop his own, flawed, philosophy on parenting, Masuka was thrown into the deep end with zero preparation. And while that left him stumbling, second-guessing, and making mistake after mistake, it also did something else. It made him honest. And that is the biggest difference between Masuka and Dexter. Masuka never pretended to be something he wasn't. When Dexter was around Harrison, he carefully played the role of the perfect dad. Loving, responsible, always in control. But it was an illusion, a mask he put on to keep his son from ever seeing what was underneath. Every interaction was calculated, every lesson had an ulterior motive. Every moment of affection was carefully curated to maintain the lie. Masuka didn't do that. Sure, he avoided uncomfortable emotions, and yes, he tried to buy his way into fatherhood with money. But at no point did he lie to Nikki about who he was. He never manipulated her into seeing him as something he wasn't. If anything, his biggest flaw was that he didn't know how to be better, but at least he was willing to try. And then there's the biggest difference of all. Dexter abandoned Harrison. Masuka didn't abandon Nikki. This is the moment where everything changes. Dexter, the man who spent years crafting an environment of safety and control for his son, the man who justified his every action by saying it was to protect Harrison, he was the one who walked away. He faked his death. He left Harrison in the care of a fugitive. He gave up on fatherhood because he believed that Harrison would be better off without him. Masuka never did that. Despite all his flaws, despite his awkwardness, despite his complete lack of preparation, he stayed. He didn't run. He didn't fake his own death. He didn't manipulate Nikki into believing something false. And that's why, in the end, Masuka, awkward, inappropriate, emotionally stunted Masuka, might have actually been the better father. Because he didn't try to mold Nikki into something she wasn't. He didn't run when things got hard. He may not have been perfect, but at least he was there. And sometimes, that's all that really matters. And then, Nikki was gone. After season 8, Nikki Walters disappeared from the story. She was never mentioned again. Not in Dexter, New Blood, not even in passing. So what happened to her? Did she and Masuka stay in touch? Or did their relationship slowly fade away? Knowing Masuka, it's possible that after the initial excitement of reconnecting wore off, things just went back to normal. Maybe he continued to support her financially, but their bond never fully formed. Maybe she went to college, started her own life, and left the whole thing behind. Or maybe Masuka surprised everyone. Maybe he kept calling, kept checking in. Maybe, against all odds, he actually figured out how to be a dad. The truth is, we'll never know. But if there's one thing Dexter has taught us, it's that people don't change easily. Masuka might have taken a step forward, But was it enough? At the end of Dexter, Masuka was still Masuka. He still made dirty jokes, still laughed at crime scenes, still played the same role he always had. But something had changed. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just looking out for himself. But does that mean he actually changed? Or was Nikki just another passing moment in his life? Something that shook him for a brief time but ultimately left him the same? To answer that, we need to look deeper. Because change isn't always about grand transformations. It's not always about becoming someone entirely new overnight. Sometimes change is subtle. Sometimes it's about a shift in perspective, a crack in the foundation of who you thought you were. And for Masuka, that shift wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, but it was there. For the first time, he had to consider something outside of himself. Even if he didn't always know how to handle it, even if he struggled with emotional connection, even if he resorted to money as an easy fix, he tried. And that alone was more than he had ever done before. But here's the real question. Did Nikki's presence fundamentally change who Masuka was? At first glance, it might not seem like it. He still joked, still acted like the same inappropriate offbeat guy. But let's break that down for a second. If he really hadn't changed at all, he wouldn't have cared. He wouldn't have struggled with his new role. He wouldn't have felt the need to provide for Nikki in any way. And most importantly, he wouldn't have worried about whether or not he was being a good father. But he did, and that means something. Masuka had spent years building up an image, a persona that kept him from ever being vulnerable, from ever being responsible, from ever being seen as anything other than the fun guy. He had built his entire identity around being the one person in the office who never had to take things seriously. And yet, the moment Nikki entered his life, that image started to crack. And that's important. Because even though Masuka still played the role of comic relief, his storyline in Season 8 proved something. He wasn't as emotionally detached as he wanted people to believe. Did he fully step into the role of dad? Not exactly. He wasn't a traditional father figure, and maybe he never would be. But did he start to question himself in a way he never had before? Absolutely. So maybe the better question isn't did Masuka change, but how much did he allow himself to change? Because personal growth isn't always about becoming someone entirely new. Sometimes, it's about allowing yourself to see the cracks in the person you used to be. And in that sense, Nikki wasn't just a passing moment. She was the catalyst for something bigger. So now, I leave the question to you. Did Masuka truly change? Or was Nikki just another fleeting part of his life? Which moment from Dexter should we dive into next? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.